say the beginning of the story is always the hardest part, but you gotta start somewhere, right?
人生を変えたシリーズなのです。4年ぶりの新作なのです。というわけで。
It only seems natural to start with one of the key players in this story, a Japanese manga artist known as Yasuhiro Nightow. His name may not be too familiar to some, but the two major series that he's penned between the 1995 Trigun and the 2009 Blockade Battlefront probably are. Both series showcase some of Yasuhiro Nightow's best strengths and passions as a creator, with a penchant for portraying believable, nuanced characters, pulling you into their personal motivations and struggles, and coming up with some incredibly out there character names while he's at it.
I am known as Valentinez Alcalinella Zihak Shushira Boherets. Gambigo Bella.
While you can count the number of series that he's created on a single hand, the influence that Nightow has had is something that really can't be understated. The man's influence goes from other artists in the manga industry, such as Boichi, all the way up to video games, with even games like BlazBlue being heavily inspired by Trigun. For as much of an influence as Trigun and even Blockade Battlefront have had, there's another one of Nightow's works that doesn't seem to be discussed nearly as prominently. 2002 marked the release of another big project that Yasuhiro Nightow was involved in, but this time, it wasn't limited to the world of manga and anime. Not unlike its siblings, it's a series that's a unique blend of Western and Eastern sensibilities and styles coming together to make for a truly one-of-a-kind experience. So, what's Trigun about? Deep space, planet, future, gun action? What's Blockade Battlefront? Humanity and supernatural life coalescing in the melting pot formerly known as New York City. So, what's Gungrave about? Debuting in mid to late 2002, Gungrave is possibly the most unique of the franchises that Nightow was involved in. From its humble start on the PS2, Gungrave managed to briefly blossom into a multimedia franchise, amounting to 2 games and a 26-episode anime series in the early 2000s. While that anime adaptation is perhaps what the franchise is best known for, there's really only one proper starting point. The original third-person shooter on the PlayStation 2,
Gungrave.
If you're not familiar with the original Gungrave, but you know your anime industry veterans, odds are good you might recognize some of the staff behind the game. That isn't even counting Yasuhiro Nightow himself, who created the core concept and the characters. Some of the other staff involved with Gungrave includes Mahiro Maeda, the director of Blue Sub 6 and The Animatrix, and the mechanical designs of Kosuke Fujishima, the creator of Oh My Goddess and You're Under Arrest. The game's core development was handled by the entirety of Red Entertainment, the studio behind the original 5 Sakura Wars games, while the cutscenes were handled by Ikosabune, a studio that had a hand with the Lunar and Grandia series. Try to keep those guys in the back of your head for a bit, because they're gonna find a way to boomerang back into this discussion. I'm gonna be honest, this video's main goal is not to shine an exhaustive analytical lens on the Gungrave franchise. Look, if you want an all-out, hour-long analysis video, just go digging around YouTube a little bit. There's a whole bunch of guys out there catering to that little niche, making home movies out of their own opinions. This video's main goal is to serve as something of a somewhat brisk introduction to each of the installments in the Gungrave series, and why I feel they're still worthy of a recommendation nearly 2 decades after the fact. You know, a blind recommendation, that's not really gonna cut it either, so don't go into this expecting a half-baked look at the franchise. If we're gonna get a proper understanding of what Gungrave is and what makes it unique, we gotta answer 2 questions about the first installment. Just what kind of game is it? And what sort of experience is it even trying to deliver in the first place? Each installment in the Gungrave series follows the adventures of a gunslinger known as Beyond the Grave, typically just called Grave. He's what the series eventually comes to know as a dead man, which is what becomes of a person who undergoes a process known as necrolization. Necrolization can effectively revive someone from the dead, gaining superhuman endurance and durability in the process, but at the cost of needing constant blood transfusions to even survive. The original Gungrave offloads the bulk of its story within the first 2 minutes of starting a new game, showing a young girl bleeding out as she lugs around a heavy iron suitcase through a snowy city in the dead of night. She does eventually lug her way to her destination, only just collapsing against the door of an underground hideout. It's through this cutscene where you're very quickly acquainted with the core cast of Gungrave. That includes Mika, a young girl with nowhere else to turn, Dr. T, the scientist responsible for Grave's very existence, and of course, Grave himself. This first cutscene actually does a lot to show you how Gungrave goes about framing its whole world, giving you glimpses into what Grave's main motivation and goals are, what the state of the city is, and the relationships of the characters themselves, all through passing little mentions in the game's dialogue. It's through this introductory cutscene that you learn the entire city is under the rule of a mafia syndicate known in this game as the eponymous Syndicate, itself led by a man known as Harry McDowell, controlling the city from an otherworldly tower looming in the center of the metropolis. You can make the argument that story really isn't as important to games as it is to other media, and hell, you can especially make the same case for Gungrave itself. But I think there's something really endearing about the way the original Gungrave feeds you little bits of additional story. Instead of using long-winded cutscenes to elaborate on the game's plot, Gungrave instead leans more into ambiguity, sprinkling illusions of a world beyond your sight into its dialogue. It only ever shows you just enough so that you get a better understanding of the current situation that you're in.
反逆の理由はビッグダディへの忠義ですか
Gungrave itself is divided into 6 different stages, sandwiched by a few brief cutscenes as Grave progresses throughout the game. Between the game's 6 different missions, Grave returns to the hideout with Mika and Dr. T, where you can interact with them in the game's sparse downtime. It's in these moments where you learn about the finer details of the game, such as your next objective, Mika's past, and about the Syndicate's distribution of a mysterious drug known as Seed, all relayed to you through natural musings and passing talks that never really overstay their welcome.
しかし希望か。お前にこれほど似合わない言葉もないな。
Personally, I would say the more subdued approach to how Gungrave tells its story is what helps contribute to its style, making it one of the more standout elements of the overall package. I mean, hell, if you break it down, the plot is all about a zombie cowboy taking revenge against the mafia, and Gungrave paints it all in such a way that it never feels deliberately over the top. Don't get my words twisted here. Gungrave isn't on the same level as something like Devil May Cry 3 when it comes to how well we can execute a story in an action game. For all the different flourishes in Gungrave's style, it's ultimately a very simple story that never really overstays the single sitting it'll take you to see the ending.
2 hours? That means combined this game is less than...
Gungrave isn't a very long game, and it's also not a very complicated one. Sure, it might be a third-person shooter, but it's mechanically very, very simple. The game only uses a handful of the PlayStation 2's buttons to fire your handguns, sweep enemies with a melee attack, and dive away from oncoming enemy attacks. For the game's more chaotic moments, the 4th button lets you use Grave's coffin to use a special attack known as the Demolition Shot. There's only about 2 of these to speak of, and playing through the game naturally unlocks stronger versions of them to switch between. Really, what you start with is what you end the game with. I know it might sound like a bit of a letdown for an action game to have such a sparse move list, but honestly, Gungrave really doesn't need any additional mechanics, especially given how little resistance enemies themselves put up. Sure, the game has a number of different enemy types, especially towards the finale, but really the bulk of enemies are like dominoes just waiting to be tipped over. It may be easy, but Gungrave is deliberately balanced around that simplicity. You're encouraged to play as aggressively as possible, shooting anything and everything around you just to keep your combo gauge up. Keeping that gauge up gradually fills up another dedicated gauge. And when that's filled completely, you get another demolition shot to play around with. This entire flow of maintaining a combo streak to load up on special attacks is all here to encourage a more all-out style of play.
What are you doing, motherfucker? Oh! Oh! How's it taste?
Reinforcing all of that is a dual-layered health system, with Grave only able to take any real damage if his regenerative armor has been depleted first, which gives you some extra room to play a little more recklessly. In fact, Gungrave is actually so easy that a drunken Japanese salaryman could get home after a day of work and still have a blast with the game. That's not even hyperbole. That was straight on the original design philosophy behind Gungrave.
Huh? What was that?
Yasuhiro Nightow and the game's producer, Toro Kubo, intended for the game to be a really easygoing ride, simple enough for the tired salaryman to just pick up and enjoy. It was one of the very few things that Nightow himself actually had in mind when working on Gungrave, as he didn't actually come up with the various game systems or even the story. Those were the work of Red Entertainment and Ikasabune, respectively. Nightow knew from the start that he was primarily focused on just two things: a Hong Kong noir setting and exciting gunplay, stating that he couldn't care less about the rest. Among the few elements established early in development was to keep the difficulty lenient enough for the weary, hard-working adult to enjoy, and a progression where the player started in the base of a city and eventually fought their way to the top of a tower. This isn't about to turn into an episode of Did You Know Gaming, so if you want to learn more about the game's development, consider checking out the game's art book, The Gungrave Archives. There's all kinds of fun details in those art books, like how Gungrave only even happened in the first place because Nightow and Kubo just happened to bump into each other for the first time in a Toys R Us. Shortly after that chance meeting, the rest of the development team was brought in, adding their own personal touches to Naitow's original proposal, with the final result being an experience more akin to an arcade-style rail shooter than anything else. It's a game that's style first and everything else second, down to its very concept, its very core, something carried by the game's presentation.
This party's getting crazy. Let's rock.
The main intention behind the game's look was to craft a style as close to Japanese animation as possible, and while Gungrave doesn't quite have the look of a traditional anime, it definitely captures the direction and essence of a late 90s anime series, with a run-down, dingy world accentuated with bold black lines, heavy contrasts, and neon lights. A special mention goes out to the game's extremely punchy sound design. If you can hear past the sounds of crunchy explosions and bullet-laden chaos, you can just barely make out the musical stylings of Sunio Imahori, the very same guy who scored the Trigun anime. His compositions bring a very unique style to the Gungrave series, which all generally float between bombastic jazz pieces and more somber acoustic melodies, with other genres like bluegrass and baroque mixed in, all complementing the series strangely perfectly.
恩の代わりにせめて倒そうと思ったが何も返せなかったな。
All these different elements come together to make for a game with a really unique style all its own. There's really a certain elegance in how Gungrave balances all of its simple mechanics together, and it's really clear that a lot of love was put into the project. There's simpler games out there, sure, and there's more complicated action games out there, yeah. But action games that embrace that simplicity to the extent that Gungrave does? You know, that's a bit of a tougher sell to the masses nowadays, but it's part of what makes Gungrave so unique in the first place. While the original Gungrave is, at least in my mind, the best introduction to the series, it also hasn't been re-released or ported beyond the PlayStation 2 in any form whatsoever. I mean, hey, if Shadow Man and Blood Rain can get remastered nowadays, and Sega's been really friendly with PC re-releases, more open to them than ever before, then, in unrelated news, did you know that the new Xbox systems are actually capable of running RetroArch on them?
You are a pirate!
Gungrave itself released in the midst of a time frame that saw a slew of video game series getting anime adaptations. And I'm not talking about some one-off OVA series. I'm talking about full-on, broadcast-on-TV anime series. In late 2003, there were two notable video game IPs that got the anime adaptation treatment. By process of elimination, you already know one of these two names is going to be Gungrave, which premiered on October 7th of 2003. And the other one's F-Zero. While F-Zero's premise is at least barely flexible enough to be stretched into a 51-episode anime series, you can't really make the same claim for Gungrave. With a premise as cut and dry as the PS2 game, the main question is just how you can ride the zombified hitman takes revenge against the local mafia concept out for a whole 26 episodes. The original game was deliberately designed with stylish gameplay at the wheel with everything else stuffed into the backseat. You couldn't just take everything that the original game embodied, convert it into an anime, and expect it to still work all the same, right?
Eddie! 足りねえ。命だけじゃ物足りねえ。てめえの全てを消してやる。奪ってやる。ブランド
Animated by Studio Madhouse, the Gungrave anime is locked square into its own continuity, going in a wildly different direction from the original game. While that core setup is still intact, several of the game's more supernatural and outlandish elements are recontextualized and further fleshed out in the anime. The thing is, those elements aren't even the main focus of the anime, as they're more of a backdrop for a far more intimate story, something that explores more personal themes as the series expands upon the characters featured in that original PS2 game. It's actually really hard to talk about the Gungrave anime without spoiling some elements of the original game's really loose story, especially given that the show's main theme is built off the backbone of a very pivotal late game moment from the original. While it isn't necessary, I personally do feel that playing the original game before watching the anime helps give you a deeper appreciation for how this adaptation actually expands upon the original game's really sparse story. The anime still follows the same general plot, with Beyond the Grave taking up arms against the Syndicate, known in this show as Millennium. The main difference with the anime, though, is that it builds up to that huge confrontation by showing you Grave's former life as the more reserved Brandon Heat.
マリアへプレゼントでもするつもりか？やめとけよブランド。向こうに迷惑がかかるだけだぜ。
While episode 1 of the show sets the stage with the main cast scene in the game itself, episode 2 and onwards focuses more on introducing and exploring everything that led to the events of the game itself. Instead of resorting to various illusions like the game did, the anime is far more thorough about exploring and building upon the exact same setting. The anime even shows you just what life is like beyond the game's nameless city, starting off with Brandon's early days as part of a gang just trying to get by in the slums with his friends. The show makes itself clear very early on that those 26 episodes are going to be riddled with melancholy and tragedy, as the carefree days of the anime's early episodes culminate with Brandon in the ranks of Millennium, where the series really starts hitting its stride. After the show establishes its somber tone, the following episodes show you that it's in no real rush to get going, instead taking its time to reacquaint you with the main cast. The first half is definitely something of a slow burn, centered more on world building, introducing characters, and establishing the show's main overarching themes. In fact, the anime really deserves a lot of credit for taking one-dimensional, one-off bosses from the original game and giving them fully realized character arcs with their own convictions and standards that are challenged throughout the entire course of the show. The Gungrave anime was primarily written by Yosuke Kuroda, the very same screenwriter who penned a slew of different shows you've probably seen at some point or another. That includes the likes of Scride, Gundam 00, and of course, the original Trigun anime. And honestly, I think that last one really shows in Gungrave itself. Honestly, if I had to compare the Trigun and Gungrave anime side by side, I would actually say that Gungrave's strongest moments are right up there with some of Trigun's. Similarly to how Trigun's story was centered around the struggles of upholding one's own idealistic morals and what it takes to support them, the Gungrave anime really challenges its own characters' limits as they're all caught up in a struggle for power together.
あいつが裏切った。俺よりあの自信を取りやがった。俺は裏切られたんだ。許すわけないだろう。許せるわけがないだろうが。だから殺したんだよ。俺がこの手で。
Just how far is one really willing to go in order to protect what's important to them? Are they really willing to sacrifice their own happiness for the sake of the person they love? Are they even willing to sacrifice their own friends for the sake of freedom? Can they even really live with the burden of that kind of sacrifice? Can you still uphold your own promise to a friend, even if it means turning your back against their own wishes? Can you still keep your promise to a friend, even if it costs you your own life? The anime really isn't shy to put its characters through the absolute ringer to answer all of those questions. It's definitely a show with a slow start, but those slow beginnings are really what work in helping provide the payoff to the show's second half, reinterpreting the events of the PS2 game into something that's far more emotionally charged. It's a story that isn't set in a rigid world of black and white morality. Everyone's all tangled up in a city of gray, doing what they feel is right within the current circumstances. It's a setup that leads to some really great standout characters, like Bear Walken and especially Bungie, easily one of the coolest characters in the show. It's especially obvious when it comes to the show's two central characters, Brandon and Harry, around whom the show's main themes are built around. There's really no doubt that the main meat of the show is in the relationship between Brandon and Harry, with nearly everything being built around their contrasting viewpoints and goals. It's the way these two characters play off one another that really sells the Gungrave anime more than anything else. While it's possible to interpret the actions of Gungrave's cast in various different ways, there's a surprising amount of room for interpretation in Brandon and Harry's own actions. The anime is built upon many different elements and themes, but at the core of the entire series, there's one element that stands out above all else.
I don't have friends. I got family.
It's a show about the bonds between both friends and family, and what happens when that iron bond is really challenged by the fundamental differences between them. A story about what happens if that bond is worth less than one's own ambition, and what becomes of family when that bond is severed whole. So, is it a perfect show? Not really, no. You're not going to be getting Sakuga levels of animation from Gungrave. The show's main heroines are among the weakest of the main cast when it comes to the actual writing. Brandon's silent disposition can occasionally lean too hard into a plot-prolonging inconvenience. Saying anything else is honestly really hard to do without spoiling the entire show. But in all honesty, I feel like the Gungrave anime is pretty well spoken for at this point, at least in comparison to how the actual games themselves are covered. All in all, the anime is a really interesting adaptation of a more action-oriented PlayStation 2 game. The actual production isn't one of Madhouse's best, sure, but the soundtrack? Still a standout, with Imahori returning once again to provide the score's suitably somber, melancholic guitar pieces. It all makes for an experience that, honestly, I feel is one best experience after playing the PS2 original. It's not necessary, no, but I feel like some of the moments in the show itself hit even harder if you're coming right off the heels of the PS2 game. No doubt one of the show's best achievements is how it manages to create a well-rounded emotional story from essentially nothing, and I think you'll come out with a clear appreciation of that if you play the game firsthand. Even on its own merits as a more sci-fi flavored mafia story, I'd say the Gungrave anime is worth a watch if you're interested in more personal, character-driven stories. Really, I've only just barely given a summation of what this show's even about, but I'll leave the more nuanced elements for you to explore on your own. Besides, let's be real, there's probably better guys out there who are more qualified to sell you on video essays about anime.
Let's fucking go, dude!
Besides, we're not even really done with the PlayStation 2 just yet.
That song's too depressing. Play a different one, RB.
Released in 2004, back at a time when you can actually finish a game in under 2 years without sacrificing your soul, Gungrave Overdose actually aims to accomplish everything that couldn't be done in the original game. I hope all that talk about poignancy with the anime wasn't too enticing, because Overdose's explosive tone is pretty far removed from all of that.
Looks like you two are raring to go. This should be one hell of a gig.
Overdose picks up just a few years after the first game, well after the dissolution of Millennium. The story in Overdose is a lot more meaty than the likes of the original game, starting off with an older Mika Asagi being forced to reawaken Grave after a long slumber, kicking off the game's tutorial level. Afterwards, you're very quickly acquainted with Spike, a young prodigy who's been helping Mika to track down any remaining traces of Seed, the mysterious drug previously alluded to in the first game. Their pursuit quickly brings the team to the game's first proper level, a large, lengthy hotel complex. This hotel complex is really what sets the stage for the rest of Overdose, getting you primed for the game's bolder set pieces, bigger levels, and even its more in-depth scoring system. The main goal behind Overdose was to create an experience that tripled whatever the original Gungrave did. We're talking about 3 times the action, 3 times the cutscenes, 3 times the characters, but not 3 times the levels. They just didn't have enough for that.
Hey, freak boy! You're the big boss?
Now, find a new rival.
Overdose introduces 2 new playable characters encountered early on into the adventure, though you won't be able to play as them until you beat the game once with Grave himself. While tensions between the 3 start off red hot, the trio soon realizes that they share a common enemy in a new mafia syndicate, picking up the pieces left behind by Millennium. The first of Overdose's new characters is Juji Kabane, a ragged, coarse swordsman with a temper sharper than either of his blades.
Hey there, tough guy. Don't forget who saved your sorry behind. I ought to break that guitar over your head.
Hey, chill out. Let's stay frosty and focused.
Usually right beside Juji is his friend, the stylish, easygoing guitarist Billy.
Rocket Billy Red Cadillac. I guess you'd say I'm a ghost.
A ghost haunting an electric guitar and a blind, dead soldier. Quite a crew we've got here.
Billy is more or less the complete inversion of Juji in every way possible. While Juji is a blunt, ragged swordsman who relies primarily on melee attacks to dish out any real damage, Billy is an easygoing, stylish ladies' man who uses his electric guitar to zone enemies out at longer distances. This leaves the series' original protagonist, Grave, as something of an intermediary between the two, both in terms of gameplay balance and of their overall group dynamic. Between Grave, Billy, Juji, the more independent Mika Asagi, and the snarky Spike, the leading characters in Overdose all strike a pretty solid balance together. One of the better strengths Overdose has over the original game is this main cast, and the little ways that they all play off one another. There's a lot more interaction here in Overdose, this time during mid-mission radio chatter, longer cutscenes, and even a bit of downtime between the game's missions. One of the most obvious examples of this is how Spike and Juji are constantly sneaking jabs at one another, which always tends to end with Juji flying right off the handle.
Kabane, you are, how shall I put this, incredibly, unbelievably careless.
Shut your kid. You know, beating you to a pulp might help me get in the mood for battle.
Now hold on!
As silly as it might seem, it's little touches like that which help make the new team dynamic in Overdose one of its stronger elements that helps tie everything together, really selling on the more haphazard nature of this new team dynamic. So, if you took everything I just told you about Overdose, you're probably going to go on thinking it's easily the best of the 2 Gungrave games. You got 3 characters to play as, a sharper difficulty, better replay value, a more thorough narrative, more levels, a full English dub featuring the likes of Robin Atkinson and even Cam Clark, and it's all for the meager, sweet price of $14.99, alongside a few extra bonuses on top of all that. You know with a build-up that heavy, there's gonna be a couple caveats involved in all this, right?
I don't think so, pal. That's not how this works.
Ultimately, at the end of the day, Overdose is 100% more Gungrave, and nothing's really gonna change that. On that merit alone of being a sequel to the original Gungrave, I think it's worth checking out Overdose if you were a big fan of the original game, or if you're just curious to see what exactly the sequel adds. It's much more ambitious than the original Gungrave, with expanded combat mechanics like the introduction of aerial offensive mechanics and even an actual melee combat system. And to think this all comes with brand new enemy types and levels specifically designed to take advantage of those new mechanics. Here's the thing though, Gungrave Overdose wasn't actually developed by Red Entertainment, who handled the original game. This time around, it was Ikosabune handling the development. You know, the guys who were primarily involved with the graphics and what little story the original game even had. Red Entertainment was still involved with Overdose's development, but there's definitely a clear shift in the game's style. And whether that was an intentional choice or merely a result of changing developers, I'm not really sure. Really, if I had to summarize the main overarching issue I have with Overdose, the entire game feels a bit like a direct-to-DVD sequel. The production values don't feel nearly as crisp as in the original game, and it's something that's not just limited to the presentation alone. There's still fully animated cutscenes in the game, but they're kept to a minimum, only punctuating some of the game's biggest moments. More often than not, the game uses a more standard, almost visual novel style of presentation for its cutscenes. It's kinda cute for the first time, watching portraits of the characters shake and move across the screen as they emote, but it feels too sterile. There's no real style in how the story is presented in Overdose, and as a result, something about the overall experience feels less like an evolution of the original Gungrave style, and something more atypical. The shift in tone and style isn't without its own merits, but it does come at the cost of what subtle touches the original Gungrave had. That whole direct-to-DVD comparison is really driven home with Overdose's in-game presentation, with maybe the biggest indictment of that being the soundtrack. It's still Sunio Imahori taking care of the music, but the bulk of the songs used in Overdose are recycled from both the first game and the anime itself. That does include a few new rearrangements and some new songs in the mix, and the compositions are all great regardless, but it almost feels moot when the actual levels usually don't have any music playing at all. On top of that, Overdose's visuals are overall more flat than the likes of the first game. While the visuals aren't terrible, the bulk of the levels in Overdose are flatter, colder, and more sterile than the original games. This wouldn't be that big of a sticking point if Overdose didn't run at half the frame rate of the original game, while only looking marginally better at the same time. When it comes to the game itself, there's definitely a greater number of levels in Overdose, as well as a plethora of different environments, but the actual game structure is all over the place. Sometimes you could be thrust into linear, trap-filled set pieces, but then you can get levels that are completely split into 3 different isolated stages that aren't even directly connected to one another. At their best, Overdose's levels make use of all the game's new mechanics to the best of their ability, but at their worst, it can be one hell of a trying time. Unlike its predecessor, Overdose was designed to be a more challenging experience overall, hence why so much of the core gameplay was expanded upon. There was a lot of ambition behind pushing the gameplay to the next level and to really make something special. While Overdose no doubt has a stronger gameplay foundation than the original game, it also feels like stages don't quite take full advantage of that new foundation. The same can't really be said for the game's more involved boss fights, which is a definite improvement over the original game. Although maybe there's a few instances where maybe they can get a little too involved. The narrative of Overdose is another area that I feel suffers, and it's not because there's even a story here at all. True to its name, Overdose's story mainly centers around the drug Seed, and to its credit, Overdose does go out of its way to elaborate upon the greater Gungrave world, showcasing the effects of Seed and the very nature of its existence, even touching upon the ripple effects that necrolization and deadmen have even had upon the world. The primary issue that I have with Overdose's story is that while it does introduce a bunch of new elements to the series, the game barely takes the time to build upon or develop those elements in any meaningful way. It can lead to some elements of the game's story coming off as half-baked, with a little build-up or even little payoff. It's an issue that really wouldn't be as glaring if Overdose's story wasn't more of a focal point in the overall experience, especially compared to how minimal that element was in the original game.
Come on, don't be negative.
Alright, maybe I am being a little too much of a downer right now. I think there's a lot more to be said in how well Overdose expands upon the foundation set in the original game, and how it deviates away from the original in style, tone, and design. The thing is, that's a topic that strays further out from the original idea of this video, which has already been going on for, way longer than it probably needed to. Come to think of it, how did you make it this far into the video anyway? Gungrave Overdose is a fun, more ambitious sequel, but it's not as consistent of an experience as the original game, at least partially as a result of that ambition. Gungrave Overdose served as the culmination of all the ideas and concepts the team could achieve in the Gungrave series. After its release, it wasn't unusual to find a Gungrave cameo or two, but there just wasn't any talk of a continuation afterwards. Yasuhiro Nightow would continue his work as a manga artist, eventually hitting it big with Blockade Battlefront in 2009. Red Entertainment? Those guys got shopped around a little bit afterwards, finishing up Sakura Wars So Long My Love, and eventually helping out with Record of Agarest War. Ikasabune though, those guys got the rawest steel of the bunch, merging with another company known as Seta not too long after Overdose, before eventually being closed down completely in 2009. Capping off the series with a satisfying but still open-ended conclusion, only 2 years passed before the dead man was finally laid to rest in 2004. In 2017, there was actually a new Gungrave game that graced Japanese audiences, developed not by Red Entertainment themselves, but by a new development studio, Iggy Mob. While Red Entertainment isn't directly involved anymore, Yasuhiro Nightow is, lending his artistic talent to the series once more. Really, I'd love to tell you how this new developer handled the series' return, and how a modern-day Gungrave stacks up against its siblings after all this time, but it's a VR game. Sorry to say that I'm not a proud owner of the PlayStation Eyes, and the Valve Index right now is still a little too costly for my tastes. And that's assuming it's even in stock as of this recording. Fortunately, the story doesn't exactly end with elusive VR games. You see, Gungrave VR was announced alongside another new Gungrave title, with the promise that Gungrave VR was merely the prologue chapter for a proper, true third installment of the series. This third entry, Gungrave Gore, was meant to release in winter 2019 before being delayed to make the game the best as it could be. Unfortunately, this brings us back to the present in a broken world just on the cusp of a brand new console generation, with the PS5 and Xbox Series X just on the horizon as of this video's release. I mean, that is to say, that's where we were at when I recorded that line in October of 2020, because the actual production on this video has gone through so many months of delays, rewrites, and re-recordings that it's actually been over a whole year since I came up with this idea of the video in the first place. Can't say we know a whole lot about Gungrave Gore beyond the teaser and the story trailer, though. If that trailer is any indication, Gungrave Gore looks like it's going to be a huge step up from Overdose in terms of mechanics, with bigger environments, way more destruction, more special moves, and even more enemies than what Overdose had. It's hard to say what the game's going to be like with so little info, given that it's not even clear when the game's coming out at this point. What has been shown off definitely looks like a huge leap from the past games when it comes to pure visual style alone, but it's not really clear how the new gameplay mechanics are going to be balanced, what the game structure will be, and if the playable cast is just scaled back to only Grave. Sure, Gungrave Gore probably doesn't look as cutting edge as other AAA releases nowadays, but honestly, does it really need to be? As long as Gungrave Gore is a proper sequel that improves upon its predecessors and is still an enjoyable experience, that's enough of a success in my eyes. Not every game has to be a AAA open-world experience with skill trees and hacked-in stealth elements, you know? There's room for games that don't try to push hardware to their absolute limits, just like there's a place for games which do exactly that. It's all about what the individual game itself sets out to accomplish, and whether it succeeds in that goal. And from its very inception, Gungrave was a series about stylish gunplay, first and foremost. Whether you see it as an interesting little experiment by the hands of anime industry veterans, or as a solid set of mafia-flavored action games, or even as a more character-driven story about the opposition of personal values, Gungrave is more than just a series with style. It's a prime example of what it means to have soul, an essence that's uniquely its own.
終わったか。やれよブランドン。今度はお前の番だ。さあ